So I work with a great team of folks at the neuromuscular clinic here, where we have a clinic where we work with families and kids who have nerve and muscle disorders. And we're also a quite active research center. But today, I'm not going to talk so much about the research side of things, leave that for some other colleagues. But I'm going to talk about standards of care. And this is a really important topic, and probably in this age where there's all sorts of novel therapeutics and new interesting things, sometimes we don't pause enough to sort of reflect on what we're doing actually in the clinic. And so that's really what I'm hopefully going to kind of reflect on today a little bit. And so I do, as I mentioned, though, we do have quite an active research site here, and I do have many disclosures of working with industry. And I am a site investigator for many industry-based trials, and do some consultancy work and chair some advisory boards as well. Generally, other than data safety monitoring boards, I take any money from any industry-based activities and put it into a charitable account in my corporation and donate that away. So these activities, I do take travel and for meetings, but other than that, any personal money I do not take. So we are going to talk about standards of care, and there is a new standard of care document available for Duchenne muscular dystrophy community, which I'm going to pick some highlights from. We don't have time in a half hour to go through all the things, but I'm going to pick some highlights. There are some new additions to that, the care recommendations, and I'm going to try and step into those areas a little bit. And then as we go through, I'm going to try and identify some gaps or some opportunities for us as a community to do better or more thorough, or whatever you want to call that, but ways for us to fill in the gaps here in Canada and beyond. So these are the title pages from the standards of care as they were published in the academic journals. This is an update to standard of care guidelines that were done in 2010. And so the standards of care came in 3 publications, and so you're going to see me dividing them up into part 1, part 2, and part 3. And again, as you can imagine, each of these are an 8 to 10 page PDF document, and so there's lots of stuff in here to cover. And I'd refer you to those, or you can access them this way, and many of you will probably have seen this. This is the guide for families. This is, again, the updated version based on the 2018, and you can grab as well this sort of what they call imperatives section, that is sort of based on this. I will say there's some things in here that are stated fairly strongly in here that actually I'm not sure I see reflective in either this guideline or the scientific papers that came out. And I mean, just one example of that is say for corticosteroids, one of the things that's in this imperative is to start early with an exclamation point, and then really saying you need to think about this by 3 years of age. And again, I'm not sure that's totally congruent with what's in some of the other documents, and I just bring that up because I don't want people to. I mean, I think you need to look at both of these things and think carefully about that and talk with your physician, because I think for some people that would feel like a pressure-filled statement, especially if your son is diagnosed at 3 or at 4 or 5. It might feel you've lost a window of opportunity there. And there's the website. So this is on Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy and possibly many other websites. I've just grabbed them off here. So so there you go. So why are there new standards of care? Why has there been an update? I mean, I think one of the things that you'll see is standards of care are a guideline for everyone, for whether you're living in a center where there's lots of clinical trials or whether you're not. And so the goal of these are really to get everyone on the same page and include and really improve the level of care for everyone. Of course, I think it also helps in advocacy. We've talked a lot about that today, and I think using the standard of care as a document for you to go and advocate for your son's care for the DMD community is important. And again, I know a lot of the focus has been on novel therapeutics and advocating to regulatory agencies for that. But to be honest, we have a lot of work to do just in our hospitals and in our clinics to help get the best care. Of course, it builds community, and I think ultimately, and especially in this case of DMD, it really is a guide and a roadmap for research and where the gaps are and where do we have evidence and where do we not for some of the things we're recommending. Of course, we also know that in the last 10 years it's been a very exciting time for us in the DMD community, and there's been improvements in how long and how well people with DMD are living. There's more and more focus on preventative care, new advances in care, better understanding of what we have been doing traditionally, and then of course the advent of clinical trials and new drug approvals, which made updating the standards important. So, how are these kind of things created? Because most rare disease organizations and communities get together and create a guideline. In this case, this was driven largely by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and that was done in partnership with a global alliance called Treat NMD. And just to point out, these are not what we'd necessarily call evidence-based guidelines, but these are guidelines that are informed by the literature and expert opinion. And that's really where the first gap I want to point out is that at this stage, surprisingly, and I hope for this audience it's not distressing, but it's a call for us all that we actually need high quality studies in many of the areas of DMD care, and that's the reality, that a lot of the stuff is still guided by expert opinion, and those are thoughtful things, but it is helpful to have well-designed studies to support this. The guidelines had originally consisted of 8 sections, and those have all been updated variously, but 3 new areas have been put in place in the new guidelines, and that includes ER management, transitions of care, which is getting a lot of attention in all aspects of medicine, and then endocrine management. So we'll dive into those. This is a busy slide, and I just wanted to put it up to kind of show everyone how the care guidelines are organized. And so these tables accompany kind of each section, and you can see they're divided into sections, and in the family guideline as well. You'll see many of these tables, and this is again just a way for us to think about the different stages. But as I go through this, I do want to continue to emphasize that these are guidelines, and the actual decisions should be based on conversations with your physicians and other healthcare providers. And you know, it may be that even though we kind of have these categories of early ambulatory and late ambulatory, that there's individual decisions that don't necessarily fall into these neat pillars that make for a good publication that's organized. So right from diagnosis up to, you know, kind of a late non-ambulatory, a boy who would be using wheelchair all the time, maybe have trouble with upper extremity, you know, or arm use, and have some breathing or cardiac difficulties. And then down the side are all the different sections, and these sections have you know, have different things. So for here in, you know, management, ensure immunization schedule is complete, and that obviously want to get that done right away at diagnosis, and discussing the use of glucocorticoids, and then, you know, then initiating and managing those steroid use comes you know, through the rest of the stages. So these are the different ones in part one. I just want to focus on a couple things, and again, some of these may seem very obvious, and but I do want to just touch down on them. First of all is, you know, rarely is a muscle biopsy needed anymore, and that's very clear in these ones, and it was even last time, but I still get families coming, you know, from outside to see us in the clinic, and they've been told or even partially arranged to have a muscle biopsy. And with the genetic techniques we have now, that's almost always unnecessary. I mean, there are some situations, but we won't get into that. So, you know, that we definitely have moved into the genetic area where a true diagnosis is really largely driven by just a genetic test through blood work. The other thing is that we really have to do across Canada, because we actually through some various sources I've seen probably have later diagnosis of boys with Duchenne than some other countries. And so it's really important. Many countries have developed a situation where the pediatricians and family docs recognize that all boys, whatever age, with developmental delays, should have a CK done, and that's the muscle enzyme test that's fairly, you know, well, it's not a firm diagnosis, certainly reflects the possibility of a diagnosis of Duchenne very highly. So that's important. The other area that's covered here is steroid management, and again, I don't think it's changed greatly. I want to, you know, so I think we still have questions about which steroid is perhaps the best, which regimen is the best. You know, when do we start? When do we stop? Now we've added into the conversation clinical trials for novel steroid-sparing medications, and while those are still experiments, that's an interesting and promising area. I think there definitely is a trend, and it's reflected in the standard of care, to starting steroids earlier and earlier. So certainly most clinics you would go to now, starting steroids around age 4, most people would be quite comfortable with doing that. And we typically start at a full dose right off the bat, and come down if we need to. And I know there are some clinics out there that start at a low dose and slowly work up, but it's quite clear that the standard care guidelines suggest starting here at a full dose of either prednisone or deflazacort, and then adjusting downward if you're having side effects. There is a trial, tucked way down here. I've pointed out the 4DMD trial. This is a multinational trial that's enrolled about 250 boys from around the world on 3 different regimens of steroids, followed them long term. And this study, I think, will be the most definitive study to help us understand which is the best regimen of the 3 most commonly used regimens. I will say there's emerging data about deflazacort, and even some mechanistic thoughts about it that suggest it would be better, and so we're wondering if this will validate those findings. But most of that data still I think we should validate. The other thing and a gap, and I'm going to come to this, is one of the things as we start to explore the idea of steroid-sparing agents, we do have to think about all the effects of steroids and how those might be impacting on the motor outcomes in Duchenne. And so understanding height and ambulation, and that means how does your stature, your height impact how long you walk, and what the biomechanical advantages to short stature may be important for us as we start to look at the data coming out of some of these trials for steroid-sparing drugs. Even over lunch, these things which are in this section of the document really, people are so concerned about outcome measures. This could be a whole topic for a whole day of, how are we measuring disease progression in the clinical trials, and I don't want to stop for long on this, but it is this is, as a whole community, something we need to tackle, is understanding how we measure change in a novel clinical trial. The other important things, we've talked a lot about this today, but I want to just point out that that patient registries and getting real-world, long-term natural history data are really, really critical things in this era of rare disease, where novel therapies are coming onto the market or being tested. And here in Canada, we've invested greatly in this. In fact, Jesse's journey has been instrumental in setting up the CNDR, which is the Neuromuscular Disease Registry in Canada. There's now over 4,000 patients, about 650, 700 people who have various forms of Duchenne in the registry. And these are really important tools to help with clinical trial planning, and now we're using these tools as ways to collect long-term natural history data, and we're networked into this. I mentioned this earlier. This Treat NMD network, which helps coordinate that on a global level. And so please consider being part of the CNDR, because I think this is valuable for our community. And here's a map of the CNDR sites across Canada. As I mentioned, over 4,000 patients now, 29 neuromuscular centers, and you'll recognize some of these folks, great people like Alex McKenzie, Hugh McMillan, Laura McAdam, many of you will know, Jean Ma out west, Jim Dowling at Sick Kids. So this is a collaborative effort, and really valuable tool for all of us in the community. So I do want to stop. One of the things that's been added in this section is the endocrine management, and this is a really important piece, and I'd encourage everyone to go and look at this. But there's two parts to that. One is growth, and one is pubertal development. And growth obviously is a big concern to all of us. And so this new guideline has put out some parameters about how to monitor height and growth, and when to refer to an endocrinologist. And then, still in this section, considering growth hormone stimulation testing. There are very few studies actually in Duchenne on using growth hormone to date. And so most of the recommendation to use this comes out of care that we see in other conditions that use chronic steroids. And the only issue I just want to leave with you is whether I mean, certainly steroids and the anti-inflammatory properties of that are helpful. But just thinking a little bit about whether short stature may be protective to ambulation, and there's a number of pieces of work in the literature that suggest that being shorter improves your biomechanics for walking. And I just wanted to show this because this was our work here, and not because it's my work, but because maybe some of you are represented in this curve. This is the Canadian data from the CNDR showing that this top curve, if you're very low or low height, you have about a 1 year improvement in your ambulation compared to kids who were of normal height in this red line. So, you know, again, there's many confounding things here, but I guess the call is for us as a community to really think about height and ambulation as we, you know, as we think about growth hormone and non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. The other piece of this is pubertal development, and again there's some parameters about measuring testicular volume and looking for signs of puberty by age 14, and then again some testing that would be done by the endocrinologist, and ultimately you know, considering testosterone use to induce pubertal development, and so those parameters are well laid out here. In the pulmonary, or in the part 2, there's sections on pulmonary care, cardiac, bone, and orthopedics. And again, this is the table that you'll encounter if you go in there. I just wanted to point out a few things. One is that there's, you know, as I mentioned earlier, there's a real focus now on getting some of the preventative and health promotion activities done earlier. And these are two good examples for breathing in the heart. One is the start of using breath stacking. So this is, many of you will use this or see this as sort of a bag and mask, or there's other ways to do this to help inflate the lung. This is lung volume recruitment or breath stacking, and or cough assist. And so those are suggested to be started early. And similarly, you know, we've been looking at that in a study. This was the Steadfast study. I don't know if some of you participated in that study run by my close colleague Sherry Katz out of CHEO in Ottawa. We've completed that study, should have final results out soon, and that was comparing very intensive breath stacking to as needed. This study was funded by Jesse's Journey as well, so I'd like, point that out. Unfortunately, this is tough to do, you know, and the compliance was not great. The compliance, as you can well imagine, the compliance data is out. About 56% of the boys randomized to twice daily actually sort of resembled doing twice daily breath stacking. So it was a fairly difficult regimen to stick with. The other thing that's changed is the use of cardioprotective medication earlier in the course of time, and now we, you know, instead of waiting for the left ventricular ejection fraction, one of the markers on the echo, to drop lower, we now just suggest everyone at 10 years get that. And then interesting, you know, there is some mention of eplerenone in the document, and although I won't go into great detail on this, things like spironolactone and eplerenone have been getting more and more attention as mineralocorticoid receptor blockers, which probably have an anti-fibrosis and cardioprotective effect. So we're certainly talking with some of our patients about being on that. The other thing that's changed is bone health, and I think this is definitely one of the, for sure, improvements. So boys with DMD who are on steroids are at risk of having these vertebral compression fractures and other long bone fractures. Some studies, it's as high as 25-27% of boys who can have a fracture. But you know, we've never, and many of you will remember kind of laying down on this DEXA machine and getting a DEXA scan. Unfortunately, in our in our clinical and scientific reviews, no one's really been able to use DEXA adequately to predict fractures. So so it's kind of moved now down the list. It's still recommended doing it, but instead of using DEXA as a predictor of osteoporosis and fractures, the recommendation now is to use spine X-ray and look for these compression fractures, and that may be a better way to predict long bone fractures and progressive fractures here. And then, of course, the use of bisphosphonates, which are these bone strengthening drugs, are still recommended. But again, it's very difficult to know exactly when to start those, and the wording is a bit vague there. So, then in the part 3, I'm not going to stop long on really any of these. I mean, they're good, it's a good section. These are important topics, and really critical parts. The one thing that has been added is this transition section where, really helping to focus on the young adult with DMD as they move into adult care. And many of us have really been working to try and make sure there's adequate transition programs in our clinics, but focusing and thinking about employment, activities of daily living, relationships, housing, transportation, these things that sometimes I think get lost in the medical pieces of clinics. So that's really pointed out very clearly. This diagram, which was in the original 2010 document, and is lost in the new document, I really still love, and I think it's really critically important to have this kind of idea of a circle of care with people with DMD and their families right in the middle, and then us kind of wrapping care around you, but hopefully not feeling surrounded and strangled, but wrapping care nicely around you and access to all these things in clinic. And I think we're lucky in Canada that most of the clinics really have a multidisciplinary focus like this. And everyone working carefully together. But there are still gaps even in this idea of multidisciplinary care. And one I'm particularly interested in is shared decision making. So providing families with difficult decisions or decisions that they're finding difficult, a decision coach to try and work through those in a more systematic way. And we have a large grant here in London to have an objective decision coach involved with our neuromuscular team and helping families work through some of those challenges. But also things like self-determination, really engaging the youth in what how their life unfolding. And I know Laura McAdams working on this at Sick Kids. Things like social health and really thinking about trade-off of medical versus social contributions to health, patient-reported outcomes, and really getting families involved in guiding the research agenda, and that's transdisciplinary research approaches. So these are all things that I think we can better embed in here. Before I close, of course, we can't forget just the very basic things that are embedded in the care guidelines. I think are sometimes easy to forget about, but have such huge impact, and that's diet control, immunizations, establishing healthy lifestyle choices. And I don't just, not just eating habits or, but everything. Early on, sleep habits, very, very critical. Physical health and stretching, and all of you know how challenging it is to struggle with a teenager. And if you haven't established these things kind of early on as just part of the routine and what we do, it can be a real battle. It can be a real battle anyways, but it can be a real battle if you haven't started that. And then preventing falls, really, really important. And there's a little section in the care guidelines on that, and making sure the bathroom and one of these nighttime trips up to the bathroom, are always a worry for me. So I'll kind of close there just to say that I think ultimately the goal of the guidelines are to really help us improve things for people living with DMD. And the guidelines, ultimately, though, as I mentioned through here, are just that, a guide. They don't take the place of individual-based decisions, and they shouldn't be they shouldn't be dictatorial. I think there's something you can share with your clinic, your healthcare providers, and help to put in place a good care guideline, and then use them to advocate for better healthcare and resources in a more systematic way. And we need to continue to look at novel clinical programs, quality improvement, and research to fill all those gaps. And so these are an international guideline, but I would ultimately like to see us adopt those in Canada here, continuing to apply them to our clinics. They're great that they're out there, but people have to use them, and so we need to get that knowledge translation piece and get some of our networks looking at how well we're actually adhering to those. So I'll stop there. And
thank you, Craig. And as I say, Craig will be back in a bit.